Good afternoon, everyone. Here is Hershey Dwoskin.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. It's so great to be back with you again. And we're going to look at some of the week's events and talk about some of the important themes that are passing in world history and in politics and in just, world events in general, and point out some of the more significant things that have happened this week. And, that will be sort of the theme of the day. Last week, I kind of gave a brief introduction to some of the more important themes that we'll be looking at. And of course, we have to say, for all different reasons, that the war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas is not only something which has affected the participants themselves directly, but as time goes by, the effects are spreading like a kind of explosion where you have the main damage is done on the site of the explosion, but then the reverberations of the explosion get to be felt farther and farther away. And it seems as if this is a perfect example of these events. Sometimes it doesn't always have to work out that way. Sometimes you might have a conflict, you might have a civil war going on, and we still have. I sort of very briefly mentioned the conflicts in Libya and the conflicts in Sudan. And if you ask somebody who's not an expert in those places, well, what effect has those conflicts had on the rest of the world? It'd be very hard pressed to find a real solid kind of argument to say that these are world-shaking events. But it's not very hard to make the argument that the Hamas-Israel war or conflict has had world-shaking events. The events have been, the repercussions have been seen all around the world. They've been seen in world capitals. They've been seen in the United Nations. They've been seen in the economy. They've been seen in travel. They've been seen in so many different aspects of life have been affected one way or another by this conflict. I would say, directly or indirectly. So I'm counting indirectly as being a consequence of this conflict. So what came out in the news today, or this week, I should say? Statistics were published about the Israeli economy this week, and it showed a massive, massive decline in the GDP in the third quarter of 2023, which exactly matches the time when the war started, which is in October. So of October, November, December is the third quarter. The Israeli economy and output dropped by 20% compared to the same quarter of the year before. And that's, if somebody sits down with statistical figures and economic figures, you'd be very, very hard pressed to find a similar incident unless you're talking about some kind of a major natural event in a small country, like a big earthquake or a big flood or something like that, where the whole country gets affected. To have a 20% decline in the economy is really enormous. And of course, this is ongoing, so that the world economic organizations have cut Israel's rate of growth for 2024 in half. In other words, if they were expected to grow by, say, 3% in 2024, they're now predicting a 1.5% growth rate. The other statistics published was in decline in investment, where investment in solid assets, meaning especially things like real estate or buildings or other type of commercial investments, were down by 68% in the quarter. So in other words, people, when the war broke out, just stopped buying major things as well as just limiting their purchases to basic necessities. And so the overall Israeli economy declined by that much. Um, the explanations are kind of, still ongoing, which is that you have 300,000 people called up for military service, 200,000 people who have been temporarily moved from their homes and are therefore not so productive, and therefore are not paying taxes, and therefore the Israeli government deficit has been projected to more than quadruple from what it had been before. I just read one figure this morning that said that so far, this war has cost the Israeli government 255 billion shekels. So, if you want to calculate it out in dollars, figure in Canadian dollars 3 to 1, and it's cost the Israeli government $80 billion, and they only have 8 million people ish. So, divide it up, and you can see how much each person has in a certain sense borrowed or will have to pay back in order to keep the government stable. So the war has had in addition to all of the other effects that it has had on the country, on the families of people who've been hurt, on the properties that have been destroyed, on the morale of the country as a whole. The economic decline has been enormous. It has also affected the lives of the Palestinians living in the West Bank who used to work in Israel. And there were hundreds, thousands of them who would cross the border into Israel every day through the checkpoints and work in construction mainly, where they would earn somewhere around $3,000 American a month, which is a darn high salary anywhere in the world, and is certainly a very high salary if you're paying your expenses in the West Bank, where rents are low, where other costs are low, food prices are lower than in Israel proper. So this has had an enormous effect on the economy of the West Bank as a whole, and Israel has decided not to allow Palestinians in to work in Israel at this point because of the fear of security issues, and they have taken to recruit workers from all around East Asia, the Philippines, China, India, Nepal, and Thailand to fill the places that the Palestinians were working. Now, needless to say, of course, these people have to be housed somewhere. They can't sleep on the streets. The Palestinians went back to their homes in the West Bank, but these people will have to be given accommodations. And so, therefore, the cost to the employers of these people is much higher than it was before for the Palestinians. Even if they may pay them lower wages, it still will end up costing them more. So the conflict is, in a certain sense, spread to affect the entire country of Israel for sure. Tourism has dropped by at least a half, and tourism was always one of the major non-high-tech fields which the country was used to receiving. And not only that, but tourism is such a high employer of people because so many people are needed to staff hotels, restaurants, buses, etc. So the fact of tourism drying up completely has had a very, very negative effect on the Israeli economy as a whole. So that's just speaking about the economy, about figures that were just published this week. I thought I would point them out. We have to also mention that in the previous week, Moody's downgraded Israel's credit rating from A1 to A2, which is, not only a psychological blow, but also a practical economic blow, because it means that if Israel needs to borrow money, which it looks like it's certainly going in that direction, it's going to cost them a lot more. So on the actual front of the conflict, um, and just to repeat again, or to say again, or to, the emphasis has to be made consistently that Israel had no good choices once this attack was carried out. There was no magic bullet. There was no magic answer. There was no possible way that Israel could come out of this conflict with its hands clean and its head held up. It's just the conditions that were set out by Hamas in the beginning that made this impossible. So no matter what Israel does, it's going to be condemned by some people, and its choices are really very limited. And it's a kind of a choice between two bad things that Israel has had to face all this time: to kind of try to rescue the hostages by force, to try to defeat Hamas by force, and at the same time to avoid civilian casualties. And more and more of the world is being paid attention to the civilian casualties, simply because reporters are there in Gaza to record every casualty that takes place and to broadcast it all over the world. And lacking continuous the continuous reference to how the war started, it looks as if Israel is causing damage and taking innocent people's lives without cause. And of course, that upsets a lot of people, especially people who are prone to dislike Israel or Jews in the first place. So this is an ongoing problem. What is new this week, and I think what is was quite brilliant in a sense, is that the Prime Minister Netanyahu said, well, Ramadan, the holy month of Islam, begins on March 10th. And if the hostages aren't released by then we will be attacking Rafah, which is the last holdout of Hamas in Gaza. So in a certain sense, this reverses the onus. It says to the world, and it says to the Hamas themselves, we're giving you a chance to stop the war. We're giving you a chance to prevent further damage to Gaza and further casualties, but you have to release the hostages by a certain date. And if you don't, well, we've given you plenty of advance notice that the onus is on you. And of course, a lot of pressure is now, instead of being put on Israel, the pressure is being put on Hamas to avoid these casualties and to release these hostages. Because although Gaza was a crowded place to start with some 2.25 million people, the fact that more than half of these people are now crowded into 10% of the territory, in other words, the area just surrounding the Egyptian border, including the large city of Rafah, that fact means that it's inevitable that if Israel carries out a military campaign, that innocent civilians are going to be killed, in trying to capture the last stronghold of Hamas. I read in the paper today, there's a rumor, and rumors, of course, are just rumors, that all the hostages have been taken to Egypt via tunnels, and Israel will come up empty, even if they try to capture all of Rafah and take it all over. And it's not inconceivable that that's true. That the Hamas leadership has escaped to Egypt, that is much more believable. But the fact that the hostages could be somewhere in Egypt without Egypt knowing, I think that is a little bit harder to believe. And, Egypt would certainly want to gain brownie points and gain rewards for freeing the hostages themselves. So, there's so many unknowns about this conflict, and this is just one of them. The conflict has already had international ramifications, and these ramifications seem to come in so many different flavors that it's hard to decide where to begin. There's two cases in the UN, one at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. There's another case going on in also there, saying that Israel is illegally occupying the Palestinian territory and making against the law and making the lives miserable for Palestinians. It's Israel again has one of these terrible choices to make. Well, either to defend themselves in front of a biased court or ignore the proceedings altogether. And in both cases, the results are not going to be good. Certainly in the case of the South African one being brought against Israel for genocide, Israel has decided to fight back. And they even sent the former Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak to 87-year-old man to argue the case that what they call genocide has nothing to do with genocide. On the other case, though, Israel has decided not to defend itself in person, to say that Israel is occupying the Palestinian territories illegally, and for that reason, of course, it means that the Palestinians themselves will be the only ones at the microphone. The actions of the Israeli government themselves, and especially their more right-wing supporters, have only given ammunition to the Palestinians and to other anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish people to use as part of their campaign. And these actions come in several different flavors, and I'm going to discuss probably the most important one of them right now. So I mentioned that Israel has given a deadline to Hamas to release the hostages by Ramadan. Ramadan is the holy month of Islam. You might remember. This year it starts on March 10th. It's the month which requires believers to not eat from sunrise to sunset, to devote themselves more particularly in this month to charity and good deeds, and to re-examine their relationships and their lifestyles. It's a chance for families to get together, to eat together at sunrise and especially after sunset. And very often, the most popular television programs in the Muslim world are broadcast because people, have nothing else to do kind of in a certain way all day long. I mean, the ones who work, but life in general slows down quite a bit. And people do look forward to watching TV and seeing, sort of what's new in the world. Another part of the Ramadan is the attendance at mosques for people who normally don't go to mosques. So because people are not eating during the day, they have the time then to go visit a mosque. And Ramadan it's almost, the equivalent of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for Jewish people who never go to synagogue, but they'll go on those days. And Ramadan is kind of the same idea. So people who normally don't go to a mosque, and if they have the inclination, they're going to go on Ramadan. Now, the Israeli right wing has thought about, and hopefully there won't be an announcement to this, but every year for the past many years, there have been clashes in Jerusalem during Ramadan between worshippers who go to the mosque called Al-Aqsa, which is the holy mosque situated on the Temple Mount, where the Solomon's Temple used to be. Clashes between the Israeli police and worshippers at the mosque. These clashes come about for all kinds of various reasons. Sometimes the worshippers and the young kids have stones. They bring stones into the compound, which is 25 acres. So it's a very big place. And those of you who've been there know how large this compound is on top of the Temple Mount. And so clashes start with the police that way, or police are searching people going into the mosque to make sure they have no weapons or no other projectiles. And the searches themselves lead to clashes between the worshippers and the police. Of all crazy ideas, and this is, I have to say, the craziest I've ever heard, that Mr. Ben-Gvir, the public security minister, wants to not allow Israeli Arab citizens of certain ages to go to prayers at the mosque. Now, this has two horrible consequences. The first consequence is that limiting anybody, any Muslim, from going to the mosque goes against freedom of expression and what tends to inflame passions in the Muslim world as a whole. The much worse consequence is that it's telling Israeli citizens that they don't have the same rights as other people have to worship at their holy places of prayer. That Israeli Arab citizens are being considered to be suspects, that Israeli Arab citizens can't be trusted, that lumping in Israeli Arabs with Palestinians who face constant restrictions to go to the mosque means that the Israeli government is considering Israeli Arab citizens to be the same as Palestinians who live in the West Bank. So what I mentioned last week, which is one of the few, and I mean few, positive outcomes of this conflict, has been that the Israeli Arab population as a whole have been very quiet during this whole campaign. They haven't, with some exceptions, demonstrated against the government, aided the enemy, or done anything to obstruct Israel in its battle against Hamas. On the contrary, they've been serving in hospitals and been serving in all kinds of areas to help the civil effort that's been going on. So for the Israeli government to now turn around and say to these people who are, remember, 20% of the whole population, that we consider you potential terrorists and we consider you hostile and we won't allow you to visit your holy place on the mosque. I mean, just imagine if the shoe was on the other foot and there was, let's say, under the British mandate, where non-Jews were running Palestine, and they said, well, we're not going to allow Jews to come to the Wailing Wall on Jewish holidays, just because we don't like you and we suspect you're going to cause problems. So the agenda of the religious party in Israel, the two of them, the Jewish Power Party and the Religious Zionism Party, their agenda has always been to divide Arabs from Jews, and to say that Israeli Arabs are not real citizens, and to say that Israel Arabs shouldn't have the right to vote, etc., etc. That's been their agenda all the time. But for Mr. Netanyahu to go along with this agenda would really mean a disaster in terms of Arab-Israeli relations within Israel. There was a vote in the Knesset to expel the Jewish member of the Israeli far left party for condemning Israel's action as genocide. And this vote, in order to kick this guy out of the Knesset, would require 90 out of 120 votes, and they got 85 votes to kick him out. This kicking out of this person and his allies have always been part and parcel of the far right agenda to to get rid of all Arabs in, and this man is Jewish, not Arab, but he's the Jewish member of the Israeli Communist Party, the Hadash Party, which is the Israeli Communist Party, and this party has always included one Jewish member of Knesset, even though more than 90% of their votes come from Arabs. But anyway, that's a side part. But this vote failed, but it certainly was initiated by the same right-wing people in the Israeli government who are doing their best to try to do two things: to divide Arabs from Jews in Israel, to take over the Gaza Strip and replace the inhabitants there with Israelis, with Jewish Israelis, and of course to try to get rid of all the Arabs living in the West Bank, and also to take over their lands for Jews. So this is a kind of an ethnic cleansing type party, and they don't hide their aims. They don't. It's not as if they're trying to do things in a secret way. They say, "This is what we stand for. This is what we believe," and what it does is that it gives Israel's enemies abroad, Israel's enemies abroad, the ammunition to use against Israel in the International Court of Justice to say that Israel is trying to ethnically cleanse the whole country of Arabs, and this is against international law. But Israel will say, well, and they did say, well, just because there's a few radical politicians who say these things doesn't mean it's government policy. But the fact is that these radical politicians are in the government coalition themselves, and that's why they're so dangerous. So, this war has caused I said it caused division in the country, but it's also caused those divisions to be used by foreign hostile actors against Israel. And Mr. Netanyahu has not shown any kind of leadership to try to kick these people out of his government, which another party, Mr. Lapid's party, Yesh Atid, has offered to take the place of these fanatics in the Israeli government in order to create a majority, and in order to bring home the hostages. But of course, Mr. Netanyahu prefers his own coalition because they will back him no matter what. So those were a couple of the events of the week as pertains to the war in Israel. Now let's look at this war, the outside of Israel, because today we read about a ship in the Red Sea being abandoned by its crew. We read about an American drone being shot down by the Houthis in Yemen. We read that the amount of passage of ships from the Far East, from China, from Japan, from other countries in the Far East going to Europe, that more than 50% have now elected to go around the whole bottom of Africa and come up the west coast of Africa rather than go through the Suez Canal. Because to go through the Suez Canal means you have to pass through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea and pass right by Yemen. And that's where the Houthis are based, and that's where they're shooting missiles at any ship that they deem to be hostile to the Arab cause or to the Muslim cause. And like I said last time, at first they said they're only aiming at Israeli ships, but of course there are no Israeli ships. Maritime ship ownership and ship leasing is very complicated. There are many hands that these things pass through, and it's pretty hard to find out not only who owns what ship, but who is operating the ship, and even sometimes to where the ship is going. So this threat has caused the vast majority of shipping to detour, a long detour around Africa to avoid the Suez Canal and to avoid Yemen. Of course, the biggest sufferer in this whole game is Egypt, because the Suez Canal provides somewhere close to 10% of all of their government income. And, if ships don't use the canal, the government doesn't get income. Egypt has already been considered the second worst economic condition country in the world, major country, by the World Bank. The government is spending far, far more than it is collecting. The government is finding itself in a situation where they risk being overthrown if they reduce their expenditures. And here, on top of all this, before this war broke out, that was the situation. Now that the war broke out, and the lack of, not only the lack of ships passing through the canal, but the slowdown in tourism in Egypt because of the war has really hit Egypt very, very, very hard. But we can say that in related news today, I was reading that Israel and Egypt just signed an agreement for Israel to expand production in one of its gas fields and to build a pipeline to Egypt and to ship the gas to Egypt, to increase the amount of gas that Israel is sending to Egypt by 700%. So it's a huge increase that will take place. Of course, this will not happen anytime soon. First, you've got to expand the production. Then you've got to build a pipeline. Then you have to check for safety and check for leaks. And, it's projected that July 1st, 2025 is when the first Israeli gas from this new production will enter Egypt. And this will do good for both countries because, clearly it's an asset that has value, and that both countries need the asset and the money from the asset. So that was one little drop of good news in the mix of all the bad news that we were reading about. The attacks on Red Sea shipping is something that really the whole world should be concerned about, including especially countries like China and India, because their ships are the ones who are going to Europe with their exports. And I'm talking specifically about China because they are a world power. They have a base in a country called Djibouti, which is on the south shore of the Red Sea. And yet China has not taken any part or said anything or stepped up or sent any warships to help the US and to help Great Britain to monitor the Red Sea, to shoot down these missiles that are being shot from Yemen. And obviously it's politics that are involved because China sees itself on the opposite side of the US. And therefore they say, well, if the US has a problem in the Red Sea, it's their problem to fix. But of course, all of world trade is being affected by this very same problem. So let's also let me now talk about another aspect of this war. Remember, we're talking about this sort of expansion or reverberation of the war. And that is the subject of anti-Semitism. In other words, anti-Jewish feelings that are being expressed all around the world, in addition to anti-Israeli feelings. It's very hard to sometimes separate these two subjects. And very often, people who are accused of anti-Semitism will say, well, we're not anti-Jewish, we're just anti-Israeli. And in some cases, it might be logical to say that there is a distinction in those two statements. But in other ways, there really is no distinction. In other ways, depending on exactly what is said, it's very easy to construe anti-Israeli statements with being anti-Semitic. And of course, Israel is a democracy and has its own government and has its own opposition. And I will repeat again that the demonstrations are now growing to demand elections in Israel, that 85% of the country wants Netanyahu out. So there's certainly no crime in criticizing the Israeli government for all it's done or hasn't done in this war. Where the mixture of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism comes in is where people will say that Israel as a Jewish state doesn't have a right to exist. Because at that point, then, what you're saying is that the Jewish people as a whole don't have a right to their own state, and therefore that is anti-Semitic. The United Nations decided in 1947 that the Jews do have a right to their own state, without saying where the boundaries were, but they did say where the boundaries were, but this right was not respected by the Arabs in 1948 when the state was declared, and of course, the War of Independence took place, and Israel captured even more territory in Palestine that they were awarded by the United Nations. But that's all history in the past. So what are some examples of anti-Semitism that have occurred because of this war? And we can state sort of in a gross way or statistical way that hundreds and hundreds of more incidents have been reported to the police in Canada, in the US, in Great Britain, in France, and practically in many other countries around the world. But there's a few, we'll call them a few actions which stand out. And let's start talking about home here. You read probably that at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, that there was this enormous demonstration against Israel being taken place at Mount Sinai Hospital. One of the, I would say, disgraceful acts was a member of parliament, a liberal member of parliament, Mrs. Garbawi, was on the roof of the hospital waving Palestinian flags and shouting that Israel is illegitimate. Now you have to ask yourself, well, why choose the Mount Sinai Hospital for doing this? If you want to have a demonstration against Israel, why not go to the Israeli consulate, or why not go to the Israeli embassy? The moment you attack a Jewish institution, you're shifting from being anti-Israeli to being anti-Jewish. And the premise that you're assuming is that Jews around the world and Jews in Canada have something to do with whatever is going on in Israel, which of course the Jews have nothing to do with it. And that's where the shift from being anti-Israeli to anti-Semitic takes place, and it's a very clear shift. There was a Canadian cyclist, who was a champion cyclist, who was also a motivational speaker, who was barred from giving a talk because she had served in the Israeli armed forces. So again, this is clearly making a distinction which no one would comb through somebody's history to find out what they did 25 years ago. And serving in the Israeli armed forces is not an illegal action. It's not, it's required of all Israelis to do this unless you are ultra-Orthodox or Arab. It's not a choice that you're given. And so this is clearly an anti-Semitic act taken by the people who just don't like the idea of seeing Israelis or Jews in the public sphere, because they want to sort of swallow up all of the air, or swallow up all of the publicity that this war is generating, and not to allow another side to be heard. So whether these are demonstrations in front of universities, barring Jews from speaking, or any of these type of things, these kind of anti-Semitic actions are just exploded since this war has taken out. Some of the more ridiculous ones that you might have read about was that in Switzerland, some ski resorts said they don't want to rent skis to Jews. And the excuse was, well, they may not return the skis. Well, it's not clearly this is just an anti-Semitic action. And everybody else in the world who rents skis takes a deposit or takes a credit card or takes an ID. And, that sort of solves that problem. Then there was a defacing of the statue in London of Amy Winehouse, who was, the farthest thing from an Israeli person, the farthest thing from an Israeli icon. She was a talented, unfortunate, um, drug uh, harmed British Jewish talent who died at a very young age because of her problems. And the only fact was that she was Jewish, and that's why they defaced her memorial. What else? Oh yes. Then I got an email, and some of you may have got the same one, saying that there's something called the New Urban Dictionary, and they just proposed a word called Israel. In other words, the verb of Israel. To get Israeled, or you to Israel somebody, means you take something that doesn't belong to you. And they're proposing this definition, and they're asking if people like the definition. And when I looked it up, they had something like 3,000 likes and something like 1,500 fingers down and something like 3,000 fingers up. So it goes to show again how the mass media can be used to propagate seriously anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic feelings, and for people who identify with these feelings to respond to them without any risk of harm to themselves. So this is this is just touching the tip of the iceberg. On more international kind of actions, we read, of course, that Ireland, the most anti-Israel country in Europe by far, has suspended airline flights to Israel by its largest airline, that the Irish basketball team refused to shake hands with an Israeli basketball team, that Brazil has just this week condemned the actions of Israel in Gaza and called it genocide. And Israel then kicked out the Brazilian ambassador. Brazil then kicked out the Israeli ambassador. And like I said, something that started off on one day in October has now exploded to include diplomatic relations between Israel and its former allies and friends, and to have caused anti-Semitism to find its path everywhere. In a certain sense, this is sort of ironic because Mr. Netanyahu in particular has always said that one of his jobs besides running the country is to defend the fate of Jews abroad. And certainly, judging by what's happening abroad, he's not doing anything to defend the Jews at all. And the actions of his government, especially some of the members of his government, have pointed exactly in the opposite direction and have given fuel to the fire for people who make all kinds of accusations against Israel, as I mentioned just before. So let's leave this subject aside for now. Let's talk about some of the other the events of the week. The most important of which I think was the reported death of Mr. Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison. And what's so shocking about this is that he was just happened to be shown on an internet video just 2 days before his death, looking fine. He's a man of 47 years old. And all of a sudden, it's reported that he died in prison, and of course, there's no way to check what the cause of death was. Um, the death of Navalny and the disqualification of Boris Nadezhdin, who was running for the elections against Putin, both of those things happened in the same month. And it goes to show that the that life in Russia has become just so controlled in the hands of Putin that the space for any democracy, the space for any free expression has just been so narrowed that 400 people who showed up to pay their respects to Navalny have been arrested. And we have gone back to the days of Stalin and the KGB as far as freedom is concerned in Russia. And, you know, there was a very brief time in Russian history post-Soviet Union in the 1990s when Boris Yeltsin was the president of the country, where there was hope that some kind of real type of democracy with Western values would be established in the country. But, you know, partly because of Yeltsin's own failures and weaknesses, and partly because of the opposition to these ideas, Putin rapidly took over and transformed the country slowly and bit by bit into the kind of ideological dictatorship that it is today. The difference is, of course, that it's not a communist country. It's not communism which is being promoted, but it's a kind of Russian conservative nationalism, which is being promoted, with Putin being the kind of figurehead and leader of the country in all respects. Another reason why Russia made the news this week is their victory in one battlefield on the Ukrainian front, which is in the eastern front of the Ukraine, where the Russians took over the city of Divka, which was really hard fought and which was captured by the Ukrainians in their previous offensive in 2023. Yeah, 2023. And it marks a weakening of the Ukrainian forces against a massive Russian force, which has all means at its disposal, which has not only financial means, which has military means, which has personnel means, and which has the ability and the willingness to sacrifice its soldiers in an unending way. By far, Russia is the much more strong force in this war. It's strong in all the ways that I just mentioned, and inevitably, just as they kind of won the Second World War in the Eastern Front through just plain men, numbers, and weapons and money. If they persist and if the West doesn't come to Ukraine's aid in a much more forceful way, the Russians will persist again and will slowly, defeat the Ukrainian forces as valiant as they have been. Remember, this war started in February 2022. It's now February 2024. So it means that the Ukrainians have resisted for 2 whole years against a massive Russian force, which has been conscripted, which has been paid, which has been bought, which uses weapons which have been smuggled, which has, in a certain way, an unending amount of money to finance this war. And Russia, because it has so many natural resources, especially oil and gas and other metals, these resources, even if they're being boycotted in the West, they can be sold on the world market. The money from this can be used to pay soldiers, to pay conscripts, to pay volunteers, to pay widows and orphans, to buy new weapons, and to continue a war, even if this war does not have the popular support of the people. And there's no way in Russia to know who has popular support or what has, because, like I mentioned before, any real opponents of the regime are either put in prison and killed or are disqualified from participating in public life. I'll just mention that this Boris Nadezhdin collected 200,000 signatures to put his name on the ballot, and only 100,000 were needed. And when the Electoral Commission started counting the signatures, they somehow found only 95,000. So he was disqualified for missing 5,000 signatures when he had 105,000 extra ones. What is the we'll maybe finish with this, is what is the most disturbing part of this whole Putin Navalny saga is that President Trump did not, ex-President Trump, we'll say, did not mention one word of about Navalny's death until he was prompted. Never condemned Putin, and when finally he was asked, "What is your reaction to Navalny being killed in prison?" he gave the most predictable answer you could possibly imagine, which is, just like Navalny was in prison for no good reason, the U.S. forces are being marshaled against me to 91 different cases. It's all a political hack job, and I'm, just as Navalny was a martyr, I'm a martyr also. And but I'm smart enough to survive, and Navalny wasn't. So basically, that was his answer. Nothing about Putin, nothing about Putin putting a Democrat in prison for no good reason. Trump has never admitted any liability or responsibility whatsoever in any single thing that he's ever done that was wrong. And it's only now that the courts are kind of circling around him and saying, okay, but you're not the one who decides that your illegal actions you can get away scot-free. And you've all read about this judgment against him for $400 million for falsifying his books, for breaking New York State business law, and for carrying on a business which he knew was done in an illegal way. And for trying to say, well, they'll never get me, and I'll pay off anybody to testify in my favor. And he's tried to delay and used every trick he possibly could. When finally the judgment did come out this week, Mr. Trump is in the most unusual position of being forced to actually pay something, even while his appeal is going on. And so he will try to appeal every single case against him up to the Supreme Court, no matter what the case is. And, he's appointed 3 judges on the Supreme Court, so he figures he's got some in there. But in this particular case, in many civil trials, if you want to appeal a case where a judgment has been awarded against you, you actually have to take all that money and assure the court that you have the money, and that the money is already there to pay it if you don't get your way at a higher court. So it's not, the judgment says you're guilty. And if you want to appeal, go ahead and appeal. But all the amount of money that was judged against you, you still have to come up with and deposit with the court, either by bond. In other words, you get somebody else to deposit the money for you, or your assets are frozen, or you actually pay the money to the court itself. And if you're somehow found innocent, then the court gives you back the money. So one way or another, Mr. Trump has to come up with something like $400 million, or a guarantee to pay $400 million. And there are bond companies who issue these guarantees, but they charge a minimum of 10% upfront, where it's like bail. You don't get your money back. So if he wins, he doesn't get his $40 million back. But if he wants to risk his own money, he can put it all up, or guarantee it, and then he could lose the whole sum. So finally, we'll have to say, in the twisted life of Mr. Trump's business dealings, which has gone on all his life, um, something has hit the fan finally at this point, and he has really at this point, he's got less than 30 days to come up with this 400 million, or a guarantee for 400 million. So this is the month that we're going to see him sort of twisting and turning, and he will be at his emotional worst during this month. And maybe all on that same subject about him and his travails, mentioned that this coming weekend is the primary for the Republican delegates in South Carolina. And you all know, of course, we all know that there's only two candidates left, which are Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, and Trump. We also know that Haley is way behind in the polls, simply because, not that she's a bad person or a bad candidate, or was a bad governor. It's simply that Trump has a hold on a large part of the Republican electorate, who are so loyal to him that they will turn out and vote for whatever he wants. And she made a statement today saying that she is not going to stop opposing him, that even if mathematically she's eliminated from the possibility of winning, that she wants to stay in the race, and until the end. And I would believe that, and she's becoming much more critical of Trump than she was before, because whatever she was doing before didn't work. There's no way to win back Trump supporters away from Trump, without criticizing him. And so she started to criticize him, of course, for his many faults. And what she thinks is, perhaps he may disqualify himself in some way or other, or he may suffer some health problem, or he might even be sent to jail. And then she would be the last person standing to get the Republican leadership. So it's going to be a really, really interesting year in American politics this year. And we're just seeing the very, very beginnings of we'll call them the fireworks that could present themselves. But I'm going to make a prediction, and my fellow people here sort of follow me here. And I believe that this pressure on Trump is going to make him act out even more than he usually does. So, he's always so belligerent, and he's always so shocking. And I think this pressure will just, add to his kind of emotional distress. So those are, I would say, some of the main and important events of the week. I'm just going to quickly look over my notes and see if I've forgotten to say anything. Yes, that that the United States government, on its part, has also come around to trying to increase pressure on Israel to avoid civilian casualties. And I think that this pressure has actually worked in the way that it made Mr. Netanyahu give a space to Hamas until March 10th to release the hostages. So in other words, Israel will not be carrying out any major military campaign in Gaza, or in Rafah particularly, until March 10th. And I think that it's the United States which has been the prime mover or motivator for this strategy, which is actually quite a brilliant strategy. So, but in the long run, it does mean that the whole world is looking so much more carefully over Israel's shoulder at what they're doing. And it is no matter that Israel says we'll do how we want, what we want, when we want, no matter that attitude, they still are beholden in some way to what the rest of the world thinks, and especially to the U.S., who is a big supporter of Israel, who vetoed a condemnation of Israel in the United Nations today, and who also supplies Israel with considerable amount of weaponry. So, Mr. Netanyahu is also feeling the pressure as well as Mr. Trump. They're both politicians who are, we'll say, being really pressured by outside events and outside people. And, how they react is something that we'll see in the next little while. So, let me ask all of you if you have any comments or questions about this or anything else. Perhaps we'll revisit some other subject next week, depending on what goes on. Yeah, let's hear if you have any comments or questions. Daniel, you're around to take a look and see?
I am, yes, Hershey. I don't see anything yet in the chat, in the Q&A. No hands
All
up.
you have to do, give them an instruction of how they should do it. Maybe they don't know how.
Yeah, they should know by now. They can either raise their hand, type in the chat, type in the Q&A, many options available.
Okay, there you go. Well, I have to tell you something completely unrelated today. So some of you have been students of mine for perhaps I've been doing this for more than 40 years. Today, I went to a Pilates class and the teacher didn't show up. There were about 45 people in that big class. And I said, you know what? I'm going to teach the class. And so that's what I did. And I said, if you want to stay, you can stay. But if you want to leave, please leave quietly. And they did. A few did. And I gave an hour Pilates class, and everyone at the end was very satisfied. So my love of teaching is something which doesn't only pertain to politics and history and culture and languages, but also to teaching anything, including yoga and Pilates. So that was my good deed for the day, and I was quite happy about it.
Very nice, Hershey.
Yeah.
Still, this has not
Yeah.
prompted any questions
Okay.
from the
Well, I don't
audience.
know. I try. Why don't you advertise what you have going on in Cote-Saint-Luc? You showed me a book. Maybe our listeners would like to hear about that activity. There you are.
Good afternoon, everyone. Since Hershey is giving me the floor, yes, I will remind everyone here that tomorrow I will be interviewing Dion Irving. This is her book, The Islands. It is short stories, and she was nominated. She did not win, unfortunately, but she was one of the finalists for the Giller Prize.
Oh, wow.
And she lives in Indiana, and I'll be interviewing her tomorrow at 2 p.m. for those who are interested. Thank you. And now something's come up in the Q&A from Rona Vandelman. What do you think of Harper's visit to Israel?
Well, I think that first of all, Harper himself has been a very long-standing and principled friend of the country. Um, and I think that the Conservative Party as a whole in Canada today is trying to claim the that the support of Israel is an important aspect of their policy to try to distinguish themselves from the other parties, especially the NDP and the Liberals, who have mixed feelings about the war, who've got members on both sides of this war. And I think the Conservatives are setting out a position saying that we stand unanimously on behalf of Israel, as a way of also saying that we stand for Western values, we stand for Western democratic countries, we stand for an alliance of Western countries, NATO, against the sort of attacks of people who are not part of this group. So it's a good way to distinguish themselves from the Liberals and the NDP, who are sort of divided on this issue. And also, I think Mr. Harper, in general, has, even when he was a prime minister of the country, was someone who was very, very open to and supportive of the Jewish community in Canada and of Israel also. The fact is that there has been a slow shift of the electorate in Canada from the Liberals to the Conservatives. It's not something which is overwhelming at this point. It's not something where most Jews would vote Conservative, because they don't. But it is a shift that has been happening, and it's exacerbated by the radical elements in the Liberal Party and in the NDP, who are calling for Israel's destruction. And like I mentioned before, even though Jewish Canadians and Israel are connected, they're not the same. Yet, since there is only one single Jewish country in the world, and it's Israel, if someone attacks that country, for most Jews, but not all Jews, but for most Jews all around the world, this is perceived as sort of an attack on themselves. So this is a political move, I would say, by Harper, done in an atmosphere of politics where elections in Canada are also looming, on the horizon. And the only downside of it, I mean, there isn't really a downside, in the sense that Harper is a retired politician without any official duties, but it does send a message of sorts. And it is possible, just as in the US, that the anti-Israeli electorate, which is growing and growing, will look at this and say, well, if Harper is for Israel, then we're not voting Conservative anymore. So there's always this calculation to be made on both sides. And we all know, we should all know, that the number of Muslims in Canada, including Arabs and non-Arabs, is somewhere between 3 and 4 times the amount of the number of Jews in Canada. So if someone is looking for things on a political basis, the votes are in one place and not so much in another place. So anyway, that's my answer to that.
Okay, the next question, Hershey, and it's a comment/question. Besides defeating Hamas and destroying Gaza, is Israel making Gaza an object lesson to any other country in the region that might want to seriously attack Israel?
I think that's an excellent comment. And I think that is true in part. And I think that the object lesson is aimed not only at the Palestinians in the West Bank, many of whom would love to replicate what Hamas did in Gaza, but also, again, to the hottest front outside of Israel, which is on the Lebanese-Israeli front, the Hezbollah, which is this Iranian-backed militia, who have been attacking Israel steadily since the October war started. But Israel has already fought 2 wars against the Hezbollah, and the Hezbollah have already sort of absorbed the lesson that if they try to cross a line, that Israel will hit back much, much harder. And I remember reading the comments of the leader of Hezbollah, Mr. Nasrallah, who said that in the 2006 war, had we known, how hard Israel would come and hit us back, we never would have started this war in the first place. And I think that it is supposed to serve as a lesson in deterrence, not only for Lebanon and not only for the West Bank, but even for Gaza itself, so that in the future, if Gaza is rebuilt and if Gaza again falls in the hands of Islamic radicals, that these radicals will suffer the same fate as their forebears did with Hamas in the 2023-2024 period. In fact, if you read the Israeli press today, you'll see a comment by one of Mr. Sinwar's, one of his colleagues, in other words, one of the heads of Hamas, who said that nobody expected Israel to hit back so hard. And had they known it, they would not have carried out the action in the way that they did. That the attempt or the idea of the action was to sort of, one of them was to invade an Israeli jail and to free the Palestinian prisoners. And the other one was to take as many military hostages as possible to use as trades. The sort of explosion into the massacring of all those people was unexpected, even by the leadership of Hamas when they organized the operation. So there certainly is very, very few, if anybody, in the Gaza Strip who would, when this thing is over, who would say, well, our Lars have destroyed Hamas, but, you saved our honor because you killed so many Jews. I mean, there are people who are like that, but the fact is the entire Gaza Strip is destroyed, and people's yes, there were 28,000 people who were killed in there, which is again a kind of 1% of the population has been killed, which is quite a high number. But the economic, emotional consequences have affected pretty well all of the 2 million people living there. And so, it can't be construed as a victory for Hamas, no matter what happens from here on in.
Thank you, Hershey.
Yeah.
The next question is, March 10 is still 20 days away.
Right.
The families of the hostages and the hostages themselves are suffering greatly. Why was that date chosen? Does it have to do with the importance of Ramadan?
Yeah, that date was chosen because of the importance of Ramadan, to give a kind of a goalpost. Ramadan, like I explained before, is really a marker, the most important marker in the Muslim calendar. But it was also chosen to give time to the Hamas themselves and to people who are advising them and people who are pressuring them to get them to do something that they may initially not want to do. If they made the deadline too quick, like say 1 week, there are so many different elements. Hamas is not like a national standing army or group. They've got, different commanders, and they've got different leaders in different places. Some of their leadership is abroad, some of it is in Gaza, some of it is in the West Bank. It gives them, and it also gives the world a realistic chance to put pressure on Hamas and to understand that Israel was fair in giving them time to release the hostages. If they say, well, I'm giving you 48 hours, well, no one is going to, look at that 48 hours and say, well, that's reasonable. So if you give a reasonable amount of time, the pressure then will grow on the other side to do something. So to me, that's why they chose, March 10th as being the beginning of Ramadan, because, in some senses, every Muslim's life changes in Ramadan. And I just want to bring up a statistics that I was reading several years ago, but I'm sure they're still valid, which says that um, somewhere close to between 80 and 90% of Muslims are still very strong believers in that faith. And unlike Christianity or Judaism, the faiths hold on their own co-religionists is extremely strong. And so, that's another reason that everyone in the Muslim world looks at Ramadan as a sort of a major achievement or goal in their lives, and that they have to change their lives accordingly. So if they change their lives for Ramadan, they could also change their lives in this war. Might be the message. Anyway, that would be my thinking.
Okay, we have one more question, which is
Wonderful. I'm so happy.
so
Maybe it's all because of you, Danielle. Maybe they hear that cheerful voice of yours and they say, "Wow, look, I want to tell Danielle that I'm listening."
I think they needed a moment to just gather their thoughts.
Yeah, that could be too.
The next one is, so is the removal of support for United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine deserved?
That's such a good question, and such a nuanced question. So we of course have to go back to explain what this UNRWA is. The United Nations Works Relief Agency was created in 1949 specifically and only to deal with Palestinian refugees who were refugees as a result of the 1948 war, in which Israel won its independence. And these refugees were people who used to live in Palestine, who used to live in the parts of Palestine that Israel took over or that became part of the state of Israel. And the vast majority of Palestinians who were living in what became Israel in 1948, the vast majority left that territory during the war, at the end of the war, or just after the end of the war. And these people went all over the place. They went to Lebanon, they went to Syria, they went to Jordan, they went to the West Bank, they went to Egypt, and they went to the Gaza Strip. And those are all the immediate areas around Israel. And of course, some of them just went into exile abroad to Europe and America and South America, especially South America. So the United Nations Relief Agency then sort of in a way to respond to the Arab and Muslim world, decided to create this refugee agency to support the Palestinian refugees. To support them how? To support them economically, giving them money, to support them by providing schools for them, providing hospitals for them. And the idea was that their situation would be temporary in some way or other, that they would be able to go back to their homes at a certain point. In order to support this narrative, except for Jordan, no other Arab country gave citizenship to these refugees. So in other words, these refugees were in a state of limbo, and because they couldn't get citizenship, the United Nations support was even more important because they weren't allowed to work or to get even a proper education or to advance their lives in any way in the host countries. The host countries said, you are Palestinians, you're going back to your own country. If we want to defeat Israel, you cannot be assimilated into Lebanon or Syria, because then there'll be nobody to go back to Israel to claim their homes. So it was a kind of a two-sided conspiracy, you could say, to keep this refugee status going. What's so unique about this particular refugee program by the United Nations is that the status of refugee was given to the children of the original refugees. And this is unique in the United Nations. When they deal with the refugee problem in other countries, they don't do that. So what it means is from the original 700,000, which was there in 1948, the United Nations is now supporting something like 4 million. And obviously, it takes an enormous amount of effort, of money, of personnel to do all this job. And in the case of Gaza, of course, the people who are working there are Gazans themselves. And it's certainly not surprising that some of their workers are Hamas supporters or relatives, because, I mean, the whole territory is so small and so interconnected. So that's the complaint of Israel. Legitimate complaint is that the UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Relief Agency, rather than ending or looking to end the sort of refugee status of these people, are benefiting by these people being refugees, because the UN is now, supported and given a task to do. And that it's the United Nations own agency which is promoting hatred against Israel and against Jews, because they are supporting schools in which anti-Israeli feelings are being taught by agents of people who are anti-Israel. So Israel has had a very long-standing complaint against UNRWA. Multiple times they've asked for it to be dissolved. Of course, this doesn't happen. And anybody who is the head of UNRWA sees their own task specifically to represent and protect the Palestinian people. So you can't have, in a sense, a head of UNRWA who's disinterested in Palestinians or who wants the problem to go away, because that is their raison d'etre. But a spotlight is being shone on UNRWA because of what's happened in this war. And Israel has reported that, staffers who work for UNRWA also took part in the massacre and the rape of the women in Israel. So UNRWA had to come up with some sort of an explanation. And what they said was, out of our thousands of workers, we've kicked 12 of them out of their jobs. A new complaint has come about. I would call it the Trump method. If somebody accuses you something, you accuse them of the same thing. So Israel is now being accused in the United Nations of abusing Palestinian women in their occupation in Gaza, in the war in Gaza. And of course, I mean, it's not to say that this doesn't happen. It's a wartime and it does happen. But for some reason, Israeli soldiers are so undisciplined that one of them showed a video of himself today blowing up a mosque in Gaza. I mean, what kind of PR does that do for Israel or for the IDF in the eyes of the whole world, and especially the eyes of the Muslim world? And, there's a strain of education in Israel that tells the people that Arabs are not real people, that they're worthless, that they're enemies, and that, Jews are much stronger than them. And this comes out of the right-wing, religious, nationalistic stream of education. And when it plays out in a war and somebody videos themselves doing it, obviously the consequences internationally are huge. So Israel has to do a much, much better PR job at not only educating their soldiers, but at least stopping them from promoting their own videos. That's about it then.
Those are the questions for today, Hershey. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So nice to see you again. And I'll be with you all next week, same time, same place.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Thank you, Hershey.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.